There are reality shows that entertain you, and then there are reality shows that genuinely make you grip the armrest of your couch. Ice Road Truckers was firmly in the second category. For 11 seasons on the History Channel, from all the way to, this extraordinary series put cameras inside the cabs of some of the most daring professional drivers on the planet. These men and women didn't just haul freight. They hauled it across frozen lakes that could crack and swallow an 18-wheeler whole, through blinding Arctic blizzards on roads that barely qualified as paths, and into the most remote, unforgiving corners of Canada and Alaska where civilization felt like a rumor. Week after week, millions of viewers around the world tuned in, hearts hammering, as their favorite truckers navigated the impossible. The show turned ordinary working people into household names. It created legends. And because of that, when those same legends started making headlines off the ice roads, the news hit harder than anyone expected. Because here is the reality that no camera could ever fully capture. The dangerous miles didn't stop when filming wrapped. The pressure didn't ease when the crew packed up and went home. For several of the men and women who made Ice Road Truckers one of the most watched reality programs in television history, the years after the cameras stopped rolling brought tragedy, legal trouble, devastating accidents, and in at least one case, death. These are the real stories of the Ice Road Truckers cast members who died, faced jail time, or whose lives took turns so dark they make a midnight drive across a frozen lake look almost safe by comparison. Buckle up. This is going to be a rough ride. Before we talk about what went wrong, it's worth understanding just how significant this show was. Ice Road Truckers didn't arrive quietly. When the History Channel premiered the series it introduced mainstream audiences to a world that almost nobody outside of the Canadian North had ever witnessed firsthand. These were genuine ice roads, seasonal highways built each winter over frozen lakes and rivers to supply remote diamond mines, indigenous communities, and isolated work camps that had no other connection to the outside world. The roads existed only as long as the cold held. When temperatures dropped low enough, the ice thickened to a point where it could support massive commercial trucks carrying loads of up to 30 or 40 tons. But the margin for error was razor thin, and drivers knew it. The show was the brainchild of producer Tom Beers, the same creative force behind Deadliest Catch, and it had the same raw, documentary feel that made that fishing show a sensation. There were no studio sets, no manufactured drama scripted by writers in Hollywood. The danger was entirely real. If a truck went through the ice, there was no safety net waiting below. The water was black and freezing, and survival was measured in minutes. Audiences responded with an almost addicted enthusiasm. The first season, shot in Canada's Northwest Territories following 6 drivers as they made their runs to remote diamond mines, became one of the most watched programs in the History Channel's history at the time. By season 3, the show had expanded to Alaska, introduced new cast members, and was drawing viewers in the United Kingdom, Australia, and beyond. At its height, Ice Road Truckers was a genuine global phenomenon, and the truckers at its center became international celebrities overnight, something none of them had ever planned for or particularly sought. But fame, as any number of reality television veterans will tell you, has a way of complicating a life rather than simplifying it. And for some of the Ice Road Truckers cast, the years that followed brought complications of the most heartbreaking and shocking varieties. Of all the stories connected to Ice Road Truckers, perhaps none carries more weight than the story of Darryl Ward. He was not there from the very beginning. Ward joined the series in its 6th season a relative latecomer to a show that already had its established stars and its loyal audience. But from virtually the first moment he appeared on screen, it was clear that Darryl Ward was something different. He was loud, fearless, and completely unfiltered. He drove with the kind of reckless joy that made watching him both thrilling and terrifying, and his self-described identity as an adrenaline junkie wasn't a TV persona. It was simply who he was. Born in Deer Lodge, Montana, Ward had grown up steeped in the culture of hard physical work. He learned to operate heavy equipment and harvest rigs with his grandparents as a boy, and by the time he was an adult, the road was his home. He had spent decades behind the wheel before television ever found him, crisscrossing the United States and Canada hauling everything from produce to heavy industrial equipment, living by what he liked to call his personal motto, "Any road, any load." It was not a slogan. It was a biography. When he came to Ice Road Truckers, Ward threw himself into the competition and the community with the same full-throttle energy he brought to everything else. He drove in Alaska and in Canada's Northern Territories, and he quickly became one of the show's most popular figures. His rivalry with the established company Polar Industries gave the show some of its most entertaining tension, and his genuine compassion for fellow truckers in trouble gave it something more human and lasting. Ward wasn't just a character. He was a person, and audiences felt the difference. Off the ice, Ward was known for his community involvement. He organized food drives for victims of the Louisiana floods, committed to appearing as Grand Marshal for the truck convoy for Special Olympics in Nova Scotia, and used his growing platform to help people whenever the opportunity arose. By all accounts, fame had not made him smaller or more self-absorbed. It had given him a bigger stage to be exactly the man he had always been. Then, Darrell Ward was killed in a plane crash near Clinton, Montana. He was 52 years old. The circumstances were at once ordinary and devastating. Ward had just returned from the Great American Truck Show in Dallas, Texas, where he had spent time meeting fans and making promotional appearances. He was heading to Missoula to begin filming a pilot episode for a brand new documentary series, one that would focus on the recovery of wrecked and abandoned aircraft in remote wilderness areas. It was exactly the kind of project you would expect from a man who had never been interested in doing things the easy way. The plane, a single-engine Cessna Skylane, was piloted by Mark Malotz, according to a certified commercial pilot who witnessed the crash and later provided testimony to the National Transportation Safety Board. The aircraft appeared stable on its final approach toward a small private airfield at Rock Creek. But when the plane was approximately 40 feet above the runway, it suddenly veered 90 degrees to the right in what witnesses described as roughly a 30-degree bank angle. The aircraft came down on the shoulder of Interstate, southeast of Missoula. Both Ward and Malotz died in the crash. The NTSB investigated for nearly a year before releasing its final report in August. The agency's conclusion was sobering in its inconclusiveness. A post-accident examination of both the airframe and the engine found no mechanical problems that would have prevented normal operation. The reason for the sudden right turn on final approach, the investigation concluded, could not be determined. Ward's death had no clear explanation beyond the brutal randomness of accident. The History Channel released a statement expressing sadness at the loss of a member of their family. The trucking community mourned publicly and loudly. In Canada, Channel 5's broadcasts of the show were flooded with tributes. Darrell Ward had appeared in 5 seasons of Ice Road Truckers and had been greenlit for an additional season at the time of his death. He left behind 2 children and the memory of a man who lived every single day as if the road ahead might end without warning, and who somehow made that choice look like joy rather than recklessness. If Darrell Ward's story is defined by tragedy, the story of Arthur Burke is defined by a catastrophic mistake and its long, painful aftermath. Art Burke came to Ice Road Truckers in its 7th season a true-blooded Canadian from Prince Edward Island with more than 13 years of professional trucking experience and a personality that defied easy description. He was rough, blunt, frequently profane, and possessed of a pitch-black sense of humor that audiences either loved immediately or required a season or 2 to fully appreciate. Burke appeared in 38 episodes of the series across its final 5 seasons, cementing his place as one of its most distinctive and memorable personalities. His time on screen included some genuinely harrowing moments. In one of the show's most discussed sequences, Burke's truck broke through the ice, with the front wheels plunging into the freezing water below. Most people in that situation would have been paralyzed by panic. Burke's instinct was to make sure his cameraman was safe before worrying about himself, a moment that endeared him to viewers in a way that no staged drama ever could have. When Ice Road Truckers ended and Burke returned to the quieter life of a working trucker. And then, everything changed in a single catastrophic instant. According to court documents and reporting by CBC News, Burke was inside his apartment in Yellowknife, in Canada's Northwest Territories, attempting to manufacture a cannabis concentrate known as shatter. Shatter is a highly potent extract valued for its purity and concentration, but the process used to create it involves liquid butane, one of the most flammable substances in common use. Creating shatter at home requires working with large quantities of this highly volatile chemical in an enclosed space, and the margin for error is effectively non-existent. One ignition source, one moment of carelessness, and the situation transforms instantly from a chemistry project into a bomb. That is precisely what happened. The explosion that followed was not a minor incident. It blew the bathroom door completely off its hinges, lifted the ceiling of the apartment, and caused more than $60,000 in damage to the building, which was owned by the North Slave Housing Corporation. Other tenants were displaced while repairs were made. And Art Burke himself was transported to hospital with 2nd and 3rd-degree burns covering 40% of his body. He spent 12 days in that hospital, enduring the kind of physical suffering that leaves a person changed in ways that have nothing to do with the legal consequences to follow. Those legal consequences arrived in. Burke was charged with the relatively rare offense of causing arson by negligence, and he pleaded guilty. His sentencing hearing in Yellowknife had a notable wrinkle. Burke, who was to appear by video link from a courthouse in Prince Edward Island, arrived late, prompting visible irritation from the presiding judge, who had already signaled skepticism about the proposed sentence. In a background report filed with the court, Burke described the explosion in terms that were unexpectedly affecting. He told the probation officer who prepared the report that in one heartbeat, everything he had worked for had vanished. He expressed worry about losing all his retirement savings. He indicated that his wife was still devastated by the incident and asked the probation officer not to contact her. The court ultimately sentenced Burke to 18 months of house arrest, a conditional sentence that was recommended jointly by both the prosecution and the defense. In a genuinely unusual accommodation, Burke was permitted to serve a portion of that sentence from the cab of his truck, allowing him to continue earning a living. Burke, who had been estimated to have a net worth of around $300,000 before the explosion, watched the financial consequences of the incident consume much of what he had spent decades building. He had escaped prison in the formal sense, but the explosion had already administered its own severe punishment. Hugh Rowland didn't die and wasn't jailed. But what happened to him deserves a place in any honest account of what became of the Ice Road Truckers cast, because the accident that took him off the show and ultimately out of the trucking business was no less devastating for lacking drama. Known to the show's fans as the Polar Bear, Rowland was one of the original stars of Ice Road Truckers from its very first episode before the show ever aired. He had already spent over 30 years working on and around ice roads in Canada's north, 15 of them building the very roads that other truckers feared, and another 18 hauling heavy cargo across them. He was, in the truest sense, the show's natural anchor, a man whose expertise was not performed for the cameras but deeply, genuinely real. Rowland appeared in 8 seasons of Ice Road Truckers and became one of its most recognized faces. His memoir, On Thin Ice, Breakdowns, Whiteouts, and Survival on the World's Deadliest Roads, gave readers a window into the life behind the cameras. He was gruff, funny in the way that only people who have spent decades in genuinely dangerous work can be, and possessed of an absolute certainty about his own abilities that was entirely earned. His departure from the show came not from the roads but from a car. While riding as a passenger in a pickup truck driven by Will Morrison, one of the show's producers, Rowland was involved in a serious accident. According to the lawsuit that Rowland subsequently filed, Morrison was driving recklessly when he lost control of the vehicle and crashed it into trees along a Canadian road. The injuries Rowland sustained to the lower half of his body were severe enough to end his professional trucking career. A man who had spent his life behind the wheel of enormous commercial vehicles in conditions most people cannot imagine was told, in effect, that he could no longer do the job that had defined his entire adult life. As reported by TMZ at the time, the lawsuit Rowland filed against Morrison and the show's producers sought compensation not only for lost wages and the end of his trucking career, but for the destruction of his marriage. His injuries, the lawsuit claimed, left him unable to maintain physical intimacy with his wife, and the claim detailed a loss of love, companionship, and enjoyment of life in terms that were as personal as anything that had ever appeared in connection with the show. Rowland was never seen on Ice Road Truckers again after. The lawsuit's resolution was not publicly reported. What is publicly known is that Rowland, now in his late 60s, shifted his focus in the years after the accident to his construction business and family life. He remains one of the more financially successful personalities ever associated with the show, with an estimated net worth of around $2 million built over a lifetime of work. But the Polar Bear's exit from the world that made him famous was painful, private, and entirely devoid of the dignity the roads themselves had always afforded him. It would be easy, and perhaps tempting, to draw a tidy moral from these stories. Something about how men and women who court danger for a living eventually find it. But that reading would be too simple and not entirely fair. Darrell Ward did not die on an ice road. He died pursuing a new adventure in the air, doing exactly what he had always done, chasing the next horizon with complete disregard for the possibility that it might be the last one. Art Burke's troubles had nothing to do with a truck or a road. They came from a domestic experiment gone catastrophically wrong. Hugh Rowland's career-ending injury happened not on the treacherous highways he had mastered over 3 decades, but in an ordinary vehicle on an ordinary road, driven by someone else. What these stories share is not a common cause. What they share is the quality of consequence. These were not small lives. They were lives lived at high volume, with intense commitment and genuine skill, and when things went wrong, they went spectacularly, irreversibly wrong. The ice roads had always been a metaphor for something beyond mere frozen water. They were a reminder that risk never fully announces itself, that the most dangerous moment in any person's life is rarely the one they have spent years preparing for. The fans who watched Ice Road Truckers fell in love with these people for exactly those qualities. The fearlessness, the competence under pressure, the willingness to go where almost no one else would go. And so it is that the fates of these cast members, the death of a beloved trucker in a Montana plane crash, the imprisonment by house arrest of a man who survived years of frozen lakes only to be undone by a bathroom explosion, the career-ending injury of one of the show's founding stars at the hands of a reckless producer, feel both shocking and somehow fitting. Because none of them were ever going to disappear quietly. Whatever happened to the Ice Road Truckers cast, it was never going to be ordinary. Ice Road Truckers ended its original run in, and the world it had opened up to millions of viewers closed up again like a lake in spring thaw. But the stories of the people who drove those roads continue.